Bishop Don and I are going to present on the Doctrine of Discovery. I don't know how many of you even know about the Doctrine of Discovery, but it's a very important document that will tell a story about the church in the past and currently, and about First Nations. And I'm saying First Nations because it is basically the First Nations that were here as Indigenous people for thousands and thousands of years. So I'm going to be talking about the history from a First Nations point of view today as we go back and forth. Bishop Don and I have slides, but I have to go back and forth from his presentation to mine. So we'll meet that challenge, and we're going to be very good at this by the time we're finished.
Susan told me not to, so that I would introduce her and Bishop Don, because she didn't want to introduce herself, so I apologize. So we've done a good job of helping you.
Okay.
You're asking the old man to stand up again.
Okay. I will do this. Bishop Don is of course, Roman Catholic Archbishop of Regina. And he was actually born in Treaty Fort territory here at Gravelburg, Saskatchewan. And he went to graduate studies and the ordination to the priesthood. He taught religious studies and department at Campion College at the University of Regina. He's been very, very busy in the ministry of all of our Catholic parishioners, and even those that are not, who do not belong to the church. In 2001, he was appointed to work at the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. And really, Bishop Don has been a lead in a lot of, I think, changing the minds of bishops and people who work out of Vatican. He has a great love for Indigenous people and has walked very well beside us. And really, I'm not even going to read this, I'm just going to tell you what I think about him. He really helped a lot of us that work with him on Indigenous issues as part of our healing journey to work with the church. And he and Father John and Sister Rianne have been very much a part of walking with us as Indigenous people to accept the church back into our lives and to start forgiving the church for what they did during the residential school era, and probably in many cases since then too. But we're at the Archdiocese in Regina. We're working very hard to promote those walking together, speaking together. Bishop Don would not do this without me, and I wouldn't do it without him. We want to show that partnership. We're very committed to what we do, and the Doctrine of Discovery has really became a big topic in recent years. And so he's going to do the part about the Doctrine of Discovery from that Roman Catholic perspective. And like I was saying before, I'm going to fit in there and just talk about what happened for us as the Indigenous people of this land we're on here. And as far as myself goes, I will introduce myself. I come from Cowessess First Nation, and I'm Cree Soto, which is Anishinaabe. I've got Métis, I've got Irish, and I've got French. So, hey, I think I'm representing a lot of cultures here today. I feel very fortunate to be here with you today. I'm a residential school survivor. I went to Barraville Indian Residential School as well as the Qu'Appelle Indian Residential School. I was the first child in my family to reach grade 12 and graduate. And I went on to university to become a teacher and taught in Regina schools, and I went to my home to teach at Cowessess. and also at Soto Reserve by North Battleford. Went on to the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, which is now First Nations University. I started there as the Director of Student Services and decided to go and do my master's in education, which I did, and I was teaching in the Indian Education Department, training teachers. And I did that for a number of years. And after that, I became a curriculum writer. I did the curriculum with the elders that worked with me and directors and superintendents around the province to develop the treaty curriculum. We have, when Brad Wall was the premier, he mandated that every teacher in the province of Saskatchewan has to teach about our treaties. And when we talk about it this morning, you'll see what importance that is. But I am now volunteering and also accepted a small contract with the Archdiocese to help them do the, I guess, the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund projects, as well as working with Sister Rianne on a lot of the things she does for Indigenous relations. So I feel very, very fortunate to be here among friends, and I hope you enjoy our presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Susan. Thank you all. Great privilege to be a part of this event, and a great delight to present alongside my friend Susan. Thank you, Susan, for your very kind words. Susan is a leader in the work of reconciliation on a tremendous level, and brings so much to that work. And so it is always a delight to work together. And what we're hoping to cover, I think we'll identify 4 parts. First of all, part 1, why this topic is important. Secondly, look to the 15th and 16th centuries. What happened at the time of colonization? What was the role of the church in that colonizing effort? Thirdly, and Susan will talk about the impact of that colonization on Indigenous peoples. Thirdly, we'll look to the 19th century when the language of doctrine of discovery emerges, especially in the US legal system. And Susan's going to look to what happened in Canada at that period of time with the emergence of the Indian Act, treaties, residential schools. And finally, we'll look to the present context. We'll look to the papal document that came out on the doctrine of discovery, and to how we can walk together in a good way, drawing on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and on the TRC calls to action. So that's the plan. Theoretically, we're going to present for 45 minutes and have 15 minutes for questions. That might be...
We'll see how that goes.
We'll see how that goes. Very good. Okay, so here we are. Why is this an issue today? Let's start with call to action 49, and I'm going to read what is on those slides because I appreciate that for some of you it's going to be pretty hard to read them. Call to action 49 said this: "We call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius." So at the outset, it's important to note that call to action 49, so well written, doesn't provide a definition or a categorizing, but rather a kind of a categorizing of what it means here by doctrine of discovery. What we're speaking about is concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples. We're talking about the justification for all that happened to Indigenous people as a result of European colonization. Doctrine of discovery as a phrase gets used in a lot of ways. How did the term emerge? What does it speak of? And most importantly, at the outset, why are we discussing this today? We're talking about this because of the legacy of colonization that we live with here and now. It's part of the air that we breathe. It's part of the society in which we live with its many systemic injustices. We're having this conversation not principally for the purpose of doing history, although we're going to be looking at history, but because Indigenous people here and in many parts of the world have lost their rights, their way of living on the land, their culture, traditions, languages, and much, much more during the period of colonization, which has decisively shaped their history ever since. So today, following the Truth and Reconciliation process, we are trying to come to terms with that history and look to steps to a new way of walking together. Before I hand it over to Susan, I would just mention that the beautiful artwork that is for Call to Action 49 out there, and if you didn't see it before, after this presentation, take a look at it. It's a marvelous piece. Okay, so over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much. So the doctrine of discovery really, really affected us and continues to this day. And I just want to go back, before the Europeans came to our lands, we had, they're estimating like between 8 million and to 112 million people that lived on this land prior to the Europeans coming to our shores. We had lived here since time immemorial. For thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we lived here alone on this land. And we had our own laws, we had our own social order, we had our own spirituality. We walked with Creator, and we didn't go to church. We walked on the land. The universe was our church. And according to a lot of our spiritual teachings, we're all related to all of creation. And so we are always thankful for the animals that gave up their lives, for the plants that gave up their lives. And so we were not uncivilized, as the Europeans said when they came to our shores. We weren't farming. We had gardens in many cases. We went on our journeys every season to different places where we knew the buffalo were going to be there, the different plants were going to be there. We had our sacred spaces and our sacred lands. And we were very, very, very close to Mother Earth. So I just wanted to give that little bit of a window into how we lived before the newcomers, the Europeans, came to our shores. And we lived a very beautiful life. Do you want me to go?
Yep.
Okay, the legacy of assimilation and colonization ever since the British came to our shores, and the French, in particular Canada, we have had many things happen to us because they wanted to assimilate us into their society. And they wanted also to colonize us, to not have our languages, to not have our way of living, to not be productive beings anymore, and to depend on the government. There's many things that happened, and Bishop Don talked about systemic injustice. And as we see today, there's always two levels of justice in our justice system. If you guys think back to Colton Bushy, who got killed, shot in the back of his head by a farmer in North Battleford. And that farmer did not have to face what if it was an Indian that shot that farmer, that Indian would have been to jail in a matter of weeks. But that farmer even went to court and had white people sitting on that jury, and he ended up being not guilty. And yet, he shot this young man in the back of the head. And so even today in our justice system, there's one for the non-Indigenous and there's one for the Indigenous, and that has to change. We still live in third world conditions. We only get a certain amount of money on our reserves for housing. And because there's very few housing, there's families that live in that house. And you know, when there's a lot of people living in a house, those housing conditions very rapidly deteriorate. And some of our communities still have boiling water advisories. We live in Canada. Canada goes out there and says what a wonderful country we are. They never talk about those Indigenous people who are boiling their water every day to drink and cook. And there's kids, because they're bathing in that water, that are covered with sores. But all of us sitting here don't think that's an important thing to fight for. People are still living in third world conditions in Canada. So it's just a high suicide rates, high incarceration rates, and I could go on and on and on, but you get the drift. There's a lot of things that are still happening with racism, with not wanting the Indigenous people to step up and lead things. Wab Kinew, Premier of Manitoba, can you believe that? So things are changing. I don't mean to be negative, but I just want to say, while we think Canada is the greatest place to live, it isn't for many of my people. Okay.
Thanks, Susan. So we begin by asking, how did we get into this situation? What happened at the time of colonization? How did it get justified? Who is responsible? Who needs to be apologizing? What can we do about it now? Through the TRC process, major attention was given to the role of churches at the time of colonization and in the operation of residential schools. And that led to a focus formalized in Call to Action 49 to address what justified European colonization. A spotlight was shone on the papal bulls of the 15th and early 16th century, which were certainly a part of that moral justification for European colonizing powers. I just have to say, Susan said, we're going to manage this PowerPoint, but she's doing an ace job of it's way to go. So anyway, at the time, late 15th, 16th century, the Catholic Church looked different than it does today in the sense that it was also a political power, not a major power, but the Vatican City states covered a significant part of what is now Italy, and its relationship with other European nations looks very different than what it does today. The papal bulls that we're going to look at were issued in part to keep peace, because the Vatican saw itself as having a role in keeping peace between different European nations as they engaged in the colonizing enterprise, colonizing expansion. They were also, in part, the Vatican's idea at the time to, as these empires of colonizing powers were expanded, to use this as an opportunity to spread Christian faith. That said, when we read these papal bulls today and we hear their language, it's very difficult to hear. In many places, the language feels to us very toxic, right? So the first that I'll look at briefly is from 1452, the bull Dum Diversus. It was addressed to the King of Portugal as Portugal was expanding into Africa at that point. So, we grant to you by these present documents with our apostolic authority full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. It's an awful document. Next one I'd mention is 1493. This is Inter Cetera, and this pertained to what we would call the Americas today, and it's about the creating of a dividing line where the Vatican takes the position of saying, this is what Spain can invade and conquer, and this is what Portugal can. Should any of the said islands have been found by your envoys and captains, give, grant, and assign to you and their heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, toward the west and the south, by drawing and establishing a line from the Arctic Pole, namely the north, to the Antarctic Pole, namely the south, the said line to be distant 100 leagues towards the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde. So, at that point in time, right, Rome sees itself as arbitrating in some sense between Portugal and Spain and saying, you colonize up to this point and you colonize from there on. These papal bulls did provide moral justification for colonizing powers to engage in their colonizing efforts. Exactly the dynamics of that political situation, I think it needs some historical unpacking. Colonizing, political powers then and now are driven by many desires, and I think it would be very naive to think that these colonizing powers were very peaceful in their own kingdom and had no interest in exploring, but when the church puts out these documents, they suddenly decide to expand their empires, right? There is a desire, clearly, at that point in history, as travel becomes possible, for these powers to try to expand and take other territories. But they clearly used the church, and the church allowed itself to be used in this regard, and there is a real legacy to be dealt with there. There is a history that needs to be unpacked, understood, repented of, and acted upon in the sense of becoming in solidarity with Indigenous people. In 1537, we already see a shift in the Vatican policy, because early missionaries in what came to be called the Americas, especially one particular fellow, Bartolomé de las Casas, went back to Rome and said, the Europeans are destroying the lives of these indigenous peoples, and they are engaged in terrible actions, and we need to stand up for the indigenous peoples. And you get a document already in 1537 saying, we define and declare that the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the Christian faith, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it should be null and have no effect. But there's a long time between those first papal bulls and 1537, and a lot happened then. And of course, the colonizing powers felt quite free to ignore, when they wanted to, directives from the Vatican that moved them in a direction towards justice and respect. So there's a lot of historical work to unpack here. There are questions we need to sit with. Why did the church make such statements? What was the relationship between the Vatican and political powers in Europe? To what extent were they influenced by these statements? To what extent did they manipulate or use them? And we'll come back to a little bit of this in the fourth section when we look at the Vatican's more recent statement on the doctrine of discovery. But I'm going to pass it over to Susan now to look at that period of time and its impact on Indigenous peoples.
Okay, so this is all happening in Europe. Over here, thousands of us are living our lives, doing our thing, and have no idea these things are happening and that people will be coming over here to take everything away from us. So the doctrine of discovery is the foundational doctrine of colonial rule. It established and justified global colonial rule and authority over the lands of Indigenous peoples and all of creation, what God created for us to enjoy here on this earth. And it continues to this day. The Canadian government establishes laws and enforces them over Indigenous people. The authority to do this goes right back to the doctrine of discovery. It is the claiming of Christian ownership and rule over territories in the name of God. This is the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination. In the centuries that followed, Indigenous peoples' languages, cultures, teachings, ceremonies, and traditional ways of knowing and doing have been extremely damaged. Without this doctrine, colonial nation states have no claim nor authority to maintain this rule. So really, people came here and took over our lands and our resources and everything. They were building their empires. And they came over here and they got greedier and greedier and greedier for land and more minerals.
Keep going, or do you want me to, where are you at historically here?
I'm population before and after European contact.
Go for that.
Okay, like I said before, when Columbus came to the shores in 1492, it is estimated by researchers that there was anywhere between 8 to 112 million people living here already. And that today, in the 2021 consensus, there's 1.8 million Indigenous. And you have to remember, Indigenous today means First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So really, it's the urban population in Saskatchewan, not Saskatchewan, across Canada is 801,000 people. And 40% of those live on reserve, and almost 60% live off the reserve. And just talking about my First Nation causes, there's over 80% of us that live in urban centers, and the rest live on reserve, because the reserves that got smaller and smaller as Indian agents and people started selling our land without us. We had a huge tract of land to begin with, but over time, through illegal means, the land was taken. And so we have very little land base for our people to live on the land. If all of us went back to houses, it would be a really crowded, probably like Japan or something. Okay? So, and you have to remember, we lost our land base, we lost our natural resources, that we lived very productive lives with that before the European came. Cultural, and as the Pope admitted on his way back to Rome when he came to visit, literally genocide happened to First Nations people in this country. And so I could go on and on about what's happened over time, but when I get to the Indian Act, we'll talk more about that.
Thank you. Want me to jump to the...
Yes.
Okay. So the term doctrine needs to be unpacked a little here. As doctrines have a very particular meaning in churches, or when we speak about faith communities repudiating doctrines, we can get a wrong understanding of what's being asked here. So we do well to ask, where did this language, doctrine of discovery, come from? Because I think what happens in the 15th, 16th century is justification for the taking of lands. But the bulls don't use any language of doctrine. These are political statements from the Vatican as a political power. So let's look at the 19th century and a legal case in the United States which provided a ruling, Johnson versus McIntosh. This is exactly 200 years ago. February 2023, February 1823, the case was about whether indigenous people in the United States had the right to sell the land on which they lived. And the court ruling ultimately was no, they did not. And the explanation for that judgment, which laid out the rationale for the decision, makes reference to what it calls a legal principle of discovery. So if we go to the next slide here, I'm going to read these. This is, you're going to get 3 minutes of legal court judgment, which is a little difficult to grasp, but I think the terrible meaning of it is going to be clear, right? So the judgment in that case ruled, on the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, which they all asserted, should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the governments by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. In the establishment of these relations, the rights of the original inhabitants were in no instance entirely disregarded, but were necessarily to a considerable extent impaired. Their power to dispose of the soil at their own will to whomsoever they pleased was denied by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave exclusive title to those who made it. So in that first paragraph, there's just no reference to indigenous people. This is all about an agreement between European nations. We got there first and we settled that land, but you got there first and you settled that land. So by right of discovery, a very loaded term, given what Susan has just said, they decide among themselves, there's this principle, whoever gets there first and occupies the land gets to claim it as their own. Of course, this is very offensive to us today, rightly so. But they didn't use the phrase doctrine of discovery, but there's a legal notion that when internationally nations agree to a certain principle, which is in this instance a principle of discovery, it's a legal doctrine because it's it's universally accepted by nations. So the language doctrine of discovery derives from there. Now there's one more quote, I'll read from it. The history of America from its discovery to the present day proves, we think, the universal recognition of these principles. Spain did not rest her title solely on the grant of the Pope, that's the papal bull. Her discussions respecting boundary with France, Great Britain, and the United States all show she placed it on the rights given by discovery. Portugal sustained her claim to the Brazils by the same title. France also founded her title to the vast territories she claimed in America on discovery. Call to Action 49 challenges precisely that attitude under whatever name the European claim to take as their own indigenous lands. We're going to return to this a little bit when we get to the papal document of last year. But Susan is going to speak now about what happened in Canada in the 19th century, which very much we live with today.
Well, okay, Sir John A. Macdonald, the British North America Act of 1867 created what is now Canada. And in section 92, subsection 24, Indians and lands reserved for Indians became part of the federal government's responsibility. We didn't know that. We were out here living our lives in the West, doing everything we did for thousands of years. However, in the East, this is what was happening. They made us wards of the government in the British North America Act. And this is what he had to say. When the school, when he's talking about, oh, this is about residential schools. Well, I won't do that. But it was just Eastern Canada that was Canada to begin with. But he wanted to expand into the West, into the plains, to BC, what is now BC. So he needed a national policy. And part of that national policy was to access First Nations lands from coast to coast to coast. And by building a railway across the great land from east to west, he was going to be able to do that. So they didn't want all the expensive wars that were happening in the United States. So what happened in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, it was proclaimed that in order to go into territories of First Nations people, they had to make treaties with us. They couldn't just go in and take the land. So the treaty making process started. But it was all the while knowing they were going to steal our land, and they used treaties to do it. And it was on behalf of the Queen. So really, because we're treaty people, no matter where you live in Saskatchewan, you live on treaty land. Treaties 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 cover Saskatchewan. So when we say we're all treaty people, that means we're all treaty people. We're all living on this land. So after the treaties were made, and I just want to let you know, in our treaties, we didn't surrender, we didn't cede, we didn't sell, and we didn't give away our land, because the Creator put us here on this territory. Because of our spiritual beliefs and our generosity. And we knew for years in our ceremonies, we were being told that a lot of these pale-faced people were coming to our lands, and that we were to accept them in a brother-to-brother relationship, as kin, as family. And so when we were making treaties, we had the pipe. And the pipe to us is a very important ceremony, the pipe ceremony. The pipe itself, when you smoke it and you're negotiating and talking about treaty, because we had been making treaties with each other for thousands and thousands of years. Our people weren't stupid. We knew what treaties were. We called them peace treaties all those years. But when the British Crown came in the West here to make those treaties, we said, we will share the land to the depths of a plow. We will let these pale faces come and live among us. And we will promise that we'll live in peace with them. Well, that was the promises that we as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, we immediately after Treaty 4 was signed, all our promises as First Nations people immediately were given to the newcomers. To this day, Canada has not fulfilled its treaty obligations to us during those treaties all those hundreds of years ago. What they did instead, they put in place what is now called the Indian Act of 1876. And when was Treaty 4 signed? In 1874. So they knew when they were sitting with us that they weren't going to agree to share the land. They decided to put us on tracts of lands, which we now call reserves. That's in this Indian Act. They used the Indian Act to make it look like they were honoring their treaties. The Indian Act, it says, the happiest future for the Indian race is absorption into the general population, and this is object of the policy of our government. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question. And this was what Duncan Campbell Scott said. He was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1920. So they knew that they were going to use this. And I'm going to go back because part of it is the Indian residential schools. When in Treaty 4, we were promised at the time of negotiations and treaty signing that we would get a schoolhouse on each reserve that would help us to learn English and do math so that we could walk and work alongside these new people. Because we knew the buffalo was, they were all gone because the government made sure all the buffalo were gone. They slaughtered the buffalo, and you'll see pictures of buffalo bones all in big piles. They deliberately killed the buffalo because we lived off of the buffalo. Everything that we needed was in the buffalo. So when they did that, then we had no longer a way to make a living. So in the treaties, they said, well, we'll help you learn how to farm. We'll give you implements. We'll give you cattle for each certain amount to each family. And they also said, we'll get a schoolhouse so that my children can work aside your children. So this was the idea. And this is John A. MacDonald. He said, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. And though he may not learn to read and write, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training, mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of the white man. So the idea was to assimilate us, take our languages, take our culture, take our ceremonies away from us. And this is actually the residential school that Phyllis and I went to. This is Maryville Indian Residential School, and it's where I went. And there is over 130 residential schools across Canada. And around 65 to 70% of them were Roman Catholic. So the goal, and this is from Bishop Vital Grandin in 1875, said, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. And this is what they did to us. And who helped them? When the RCMP was asked by Chief Crowfoot from the Siksika Nation, the Siksika tribe, he said, there's so much alcohol coming to our reserves, and it's a deliberate attempt on people as well to bring alcohol into our communities, to make us drunk so that we wouldn't worry about our land being taken away from us. And so Chief Crowfoot said, I need to get these whiskey traders and all these people in the ports that are coming into our communities and selling us things. And and making us crazy, we need protection. So when the RCMP were promised by the federal government to Chief Crowfoot, it was to protect Indigenous people, protect First Nations people. But in reality, that didn't happen. They came to make sure the policies of the federal government were going to be successful. And they helped priests and Indian agents pick up children in our homes as early as 3 years old until they were 16 to go and live in residential schools. Can you imagine your 3-year-old grandson or granddaughter being taken away from your family? Just imagine a community with no children in it because we were all in residential school. Our community were always grieving because our children were not laughing outside our homes. They weren't sleeping in their beds at home. Instead, we were in an institution. Nobody to hug us when you cried. Or crying at night. Everybody was crying in their beds at night. Little kids. And if we spoke our language, we would be beaten. And I could go on and on and on. How successful it was. But you know what? And I'll end up with this and I'll give this back to Bishop Don. When the Pope came to visit, I refused to go to Muscatcheese. Because to me as a First Nation people didn't need to hear that apology, which by the way was in Italian. He couldn't even learn the words I'm sorry in English or I'm sorry in Cree when he was in Cree country. How does that make me feel as a residential school child? The Pope came all over to here and made sure we spoke English, but couldn't, and he knows how to speak English. He couldn't even say I'm sorry in English. But you know what I saw when I was watching it on my phone? I heard the announcer in Muscatcheese speaking Cree. He was going back from Cree to English, Cree to English. And then my leaders came in dancing and holding their eagle staffs and drums and the singing. It was at that perfect moment that I cried. And I didn't need to see anything else because the very thing they tried to take away from us was being exhibited right in that place. Language Cree was still being spoken. Our songs were still being sung. Our drums were still drumming. Our leaders in their regalia and their proud, their headdresses, dancing in to that place. And I thought, what a big message to the Pope. Everything they tried to take away from us was shown to him there. So going forward, with a lot of the work we're doing at the Truth and Reconciliation is to get back our languages, teach our kids the spiritual teachings, our cultural teachings, and all of those things. So there's hope, I guess. I don't want to be so negative, but I want you to understand how devastating it was that the Indian Act did. The Indian Act, we couldn't even talk. 3 men on the reserve couldn't get together and talk. They'd put them in jail. You know why? We were not allowed to assemble. We couldn't hire a lawyer till 1951. That was in the Indian Act. We didn't have freedom of speech, and yet all those newcomers came here because they couldn't protest in their own countries. They couldn't worship the way they wanted in their own countries. So they come here and take all of that away from us. All our freedoms we had for thousands and thousands of years was taken away from us in the Indian Act. We're still fighting to get our own sovereignty, to make our own laws, to go back to our own ways of doing and believing and thinking. And we would have been able to do that if people had just stopped for a minute and got to know us, because we're such beautiful people. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. I can't echo enough what Susan said, that and I would read is from 2015 in Bolivia, and this was the same year that the calls to action were articulated here in Canada. Here he's speaking in Spanish to Spanish people, right? I say this to you with regret. Many grave sins were committed against the native peoples of America in the name of God. Like St. John Paul II, I ask that the Church, I repeat what he said, kneel before God and implore forgiveness for the past and present sins of her sons and daughters. Then he went on, I humbly ask forgiveness not only for the offenses of the Church herself, but also for the crimes committed against the native peoples during the so-called conquest of America. That was in Bolivia. And then, so when he came to Canada in 2022, it wasn't at all a surprise coming on this trip to offer an apology that he addressed colonization. And so here's the text from Masquachis, although apologies were offered in many different locations. I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry. Sorry for the ways in which regrettably many Christians supported the colonizing mentality of the powers that oppressed the indigenous peoples. I am sorry. I ask forgiveness in particular for the ways in which many members of the Church and of religious communities cooperated, not least through their indifference, in projects of cultural destruction and forced assimilation, promoted by the governments of that time, which culminated in the system of residential schools. Now, Pope Francis did not address Doctrine of Discovery. Call to Action 49 called for the Catholic Church in Canada to address that, and it did in 2016. It affirmed that Indigenous people created in the image and likeness of God, our Creator, should have been granted all fundamental human rights in the past and in the present, and that any reducing of their humanity and fundamental human rights, past or present, should be resisted in the strongest possible way. And it went on to address in quite detail the attitudes summarized in that phrase, Doctrine of Discovery. But people, in a very special way, Indigenous people, but many non-Indigenous people, wanted the Pope to address it as well. So this was during the papal visit. This was in Quebec, and if you see on this one where the banner Rescind the Doctrine is presented, the purple hat on the left-hand side of the R, that's my head. so
Where? Right here?
Yeah. So I had a very good view of that banner. So discussions began with the Vatican towards issuing a statement on this topic. And in March 30th of last year, two of the Roman offices, Vatican offices, issued a statement on the Doctrine of Discovery. So they made the point that Doctrine of Discovery is a language that comes later, and that this wasn't a Catholic doctrine, but it was political policy, and it did have a dramatic impact, and they did make those statements in the name of God. And we'll go to the next quote. So it is only just to recognize, well, I should have started a little. The Church acknowledges that these papal bulls, talking about the papal bulls now, did not adequately reflect the equal dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples, The Church is aware that the contents of these documents were manipulated for political purposes by competing colonial powers in order to justify immoral acts against Indigenous peoples that were carried out at times without opposition from ecclesiastical authorities. It's only just to recognize these errors, acknowledge the terrible effects of assimilation policies and the pain experienced by Indigenous peoples, and ask for pardon. Furthermore, Pope Francis has urged, never again can the Christian community allow itself to be infected by the idea that one culture is superior to others, or that it's legitimate to employ ways of coercing others. I'll offer a quick summary here. What that statement from the Vatican of last year did, it affirmed the rights and dignity of Indigenous people, called on the Church to actively support those rights, acknowledged the great suffering of Indigenous people as a result of colonization and efforts at assimilation. It acknowledged that the papal bulls did not respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. It asked pardon. It recognized the bulls were used in problematic ways by colonizing powers. It pointed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a guide for the pursuit of justice and a framework for standing in solidarity with Indigenous people. It's rightly understood in the context of many other statements from Pope Francis, which point to Indigenous ways of living in relation to the land and all of creation as a source of wisdom that the world desperately needs to listen to and learn from. So that provided us some resources and support to continue our work. And we'll just conclude by, I think, a little word about where we want to work moving forward. We want to continue to address the calls to action, and supporting this exhibition is one way of doing that. We want to work with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We want to work with the calls to action. And most of all, we want to find a new way to walk together, to walk deeply respecting Indigenous ways, languages, traditions, spirituality, and to be a good ally to Indigenous people in the pursuit of justice. So over to you for the last word.
Wow, you guys were so quiet. Well, thank you very much. I mean, Bishop Don and I could keep you entertained for days on this topic. But, you know, as I sit here beside Bishop Don and I see my chief, my former chief, Cadmus there, who's done a lot of work on reconciliation and looking at how we can reconcile with the church and with non-Indigenous people in our walk together going forward. Because if we don't start working and walking together, my children are having a hard time right now. There's a lot of racism, a lot of laws at the federal government. We're still under the Indian Act. That hasn't been gotten rid of. My grandchildren are living pretty good lives. My great-grandchildren are probably the ones, if we don't change things now, they're going to be the ones that are going to be taking you on. Because we don't want to spend the next 1,000 years trying to reconcile with each other. So it's our job, each and every one of us sitting here, to take action of some sort. Even if it is when you see a First Nation or Métis or an Inuit mother with her children and they're making a fuss in the hall, in the aisle at the grocery store, you don't look at them in disgust. You actually give them a smile and walk on. Because we get those looks from you. A lot of people see an Indian coming that's kind of staggering and they run away to the other side of the street. That Indian is having abuse problems because of what happened to us. And they haven't healed. So open up your hearts and minds is what I'm saying and what I'm going to end up with. And learn to love one another, because Creator only wants us to love one another. You listen to any elder speak, any ceremonial elder speak, and right away be kind to one another, love one another, And that's the same message of God. So with that, thank you very much.